Kelvin, you were the first Labour Member of Parliament to nominate Jeremy. Lately, polling's been a bit rough and a bit difficult. How do you rate his current performance?
Well, I think Jeremy's performance has been first class. You see him in the Commons with the Prime Minister. I think he does brilliantly. His problem has been, of course, that a high proportion of the Parliamentary Labour Party do not support him and didn't vote for him. And of course, he's got a serious enmity in the press and media. But I think he's, I think he's brilliant, and I think he'll be a brilliant Prime Minister.
Do you think he's going to go on to win the 2020 election?
I would sincerely hope so. I think we've got 3 years plus to go, and once the EU legislation is out of the way, and we can focus on the real issues which divide Labour and Tories, I think Jeremy will come sailing through, because we want more houses, more spending on the hospitals, and a whole range of other issues which will draw millions of working class Labour voters back to Labour, and I think the middle class voters.
Turning to the EU, recent interventions by Blair and Mandelson, how would you say they've helped Labour's by-election chances?
Well, I think they were clearly, obviously intended to damage Labour's chances, I have absolutely no time for either of them. But I think many people they're so unpleasant that suddenly many people will be just turned off by them and say, well, it's not going to make any difference to my vote. And I hope that people will just reject what they've said and say they're yesterday's people. I didn't like them then, and I certainly don't like them now.
On Brexit, Labour does seem to be in a bit of a tricky spot. Around 65% of our voters voted Remain, but around 70% of our constituencies were for Leave. Is there any way Labour can unite these two very distinct camps?
Well, it is difficult, and I think until the legislation is over and we are finally out of the EU and running our own affairs again, I think it is going to be difficult. But I would say that I would want to go on and argue the case for Britain being independent, running its own affairs in a socialist way. And I've campaigned on the basis that it's anti-democratic, anti-socialist, and we should be running our own affairs as a step towards rebuilding a democratic socialist Britain, and indeed ultimately a democratic socialist world.
Are you concerned or optimistic about the European national elections this year, particularly in France, the Netherlands and Germany?
Well, I think they've got the same sort of problems that we've had. The society is very divided. A lot of ordinary people feel that the elite is not listening to them and has been ignoring them for a long time, particularly working class people, where manufacturing has declined, unemployment's risen, the gulf between the rich and poor has got wider, and people feel they're not being listened to and not being catered for. I think socialist parties and social democratic parties built their power on the basis of working class support, and I mean the broader working class, including white collar workers, teachers, and everybody else, as well as manual workers. And that support has to be rebuilt again behind a party in which they can feel confident and genuinely represents them in their parliaments and pursues their interests.
The Lib Dems are positioning themselves as the Remain party. Are you concerned about a resurgent Liberal Democratic Party taking Remain votes away from Labour?
In the short term, some of that might happen indeed, and it's possible. But they won't get enough to get many seats in Parliament. And again, it's one of those things like the SDP. In my youth, they for a time were quite successful and then faded away. I think the same will happen with that vote as well. But in the end, it's a choice between whether you want a democratic socialist or social democratic world or a free market neoliberal world. And the Liberal Democrats are clearly on that side of the fence. They are clearly for globalisation, free markets, privatisation and so on. And when I think those Labour supporters or Labour members have realised that, they'll come back to Labour as the genuine party of democratic socialism, social democracy, and representing the interests of working class people.
Is Labour facing a really critical position in terms of the breakdown in the alliance between its traditional working class vote and its middle class supporters?
Well, it depends. I think it's, there are divisions between middle class voters and between working class voters. And I come from an academic background. I'm, should be part of this middle class group drifting to the Liberal Democrats. The last thing I should ever do. But I'm a lifelong dedicated socialist, and I intend to remain so. And many people are like me too. And equally, there are many working class people who are historically conservative and tend not to be sympathetic to Labour, and that will continue as well. But I think we can still unite the party around a view of the world which is kind, egalitarian, fair to everybody, with people having a sense of self-worth, a society, a government that looks after people rather than one that just says you're on your own, mate, and get used to it.
Turning now to commercial assets, the takeover bid for Unilever from Kraft Heinz seems to have stalled for the time being. What's Labour's current position on foreign takeovers of commercial assets?
Well, I'm not sure what the leadership's position is, if they said anything specific, but I think we must all be concerned about global corporations gathering, soaking up, buying up other enormous corporations. We're looking towards what the revolutionaries used to call monopoly capitalism. And, when these organisations become so large that they're beyond the power of governments to control, they have no effective competition, I think that's very worrying. And even those people who believe in capitalism want to see some competition, not monopoly.
And turning now to the NHS, what would Labour do if it were in government to solve the NHS crisis?
Well, what we have to do as a party is actually make people aware that the health service is massively underfunded. We spend 2 to 3% less of our GDP on health compared with other developed countries, and that's equivalent to between 40 and 50 billion pounds a year. I think we've got to raise taxes on the rich, or collect the taxes that they don't pay and put that into the health service. The health service is underfunded, has to be properly funded, and it can work brilliantly if it does. It works miracles on a pittance at the moment. It's amazing it survives at all the way it's funded, but I think we could look forward to a brilliant health service, provided Labour wins and starts to raise spending as it should do.
Kelvin, successive governments have talked about the revival of manufacturing and bringing back jobs, particularly to the Midlands and the North. How can we revive our manufacturing sector?
Well, I think first of all we've got to get control of our economy, and I think to begin with we've got to get an appropriate exchange rate. We've seen the exchange rate fall since the EU referendum vote, and we've seen manufacturing beginning to grow, exports expanding, and indeed investment going to manufacturing, because they now know we've got a competitive exchange rate. That's fundamental. But I think we've also got to have a government that is actively involved in promoting industry, manufacturing, trying to build it up to an appropriate level again, so we have a balanced economy, enough to supply our own needs and to import where we need, export where we need, but not have this situation where we've got a gigantic trade deficit, where we import billions of pounds worth of goods from abroad because we can't produce them ourselves because manufacturing is too small. So manufacturing, I think we have to rebuild. I think we've got the capability of doing that, but we need a government that's going to drive that.
The Prime Minister is going to invoke Article 50 within the next few weeks. How optimistic are you that we can get a good trading relationship with the rest of the European Union and to go about setting our own trade deals for the rest of the world?
Well, I'm very optimistic. The reality is we are in a very strong position because we are the largest single market out for the rest of the EU. The United Kingdom, because we are a big economy, we import vast quantities of goods, agriculture and manufacturers from the European Union, and they're not going to throw that away, are they? They'd be shooting themselves in the foot. So I think there's a deal to be done where we say, well, we're going to continue trading. We may actually want to reduce our balance of trade deficit with you, but nevertheless we're still going to buy some of your goods, including agricultural products, which will be interesting because they are very concerned to protect their agricultural sector, I think.
Donald Trump was elected as President of the United States. He has said that he'd be willing to look into a trade deal with the UK. What kind of trade deal would you like to see between the United States and the United Kingdom, bearing in mind we've got Trump President of the United States?
Well, one of the good things about the election of Trump and indeed the Brexit vote was that TTIP has now been consigned to history. but we still have CETA, which I think is an equally bad arrangement. I don't think we need those kind of trade deals. Reality is with North America now, we have good trading relationship. I think we are still in surplus with the United States. We export motor vehicles, Jaguars and Range Rovers and so on. So I don't think we need to worry too much about trade deals and special arrangements. We just need to carry on trading on the basis of normal world trade arrangements. But I think it's the EU where we have a trade problem, not with the US. And I have to say, even though Trump is a dreadful man in so many ways, the fact that he is focusing his attention on rebuilding American manufacturing, something we should do over here.